Our culture is not only hostile to biblical truth, but to the very concepts of truth and reality. Arguably behind much of this hostility lies the ideology of critical theory. Originating in the Frankfurt School in the 1920s, it set out to use Marxist theory to challenge all previous systems of thought. In fact, this school has been described as somewhere willing to think the unthinkable, whose intellectuals were willing to imagine that the best way to serve Western civilization might be to destroy it. Underlying all this was the conviction that there is no transcendent reality, no God, rather we make our own reality. This podcast is being recorded in front of a live audience at the Christian Institute's headquarters in Newcastle. It follows on from 2 talks given by the Institute's Dr. Sharon James. Like this recording, they're available on our website, christian.org.uk, our YouTube channel, and via our socials. Details are on the screen. Together, those talks explain what critical theory is, how it originated, why we should be concerned about it, the challenges it poses to churches, and how we can respond. If you haven't watched those yet, you might like to do that before coming back here. It will fill in a lot of the background to our discussion today. Next time, we'll look at some Christian writing on critical theory, but right now, we're going to look at a few non-Christian responses to critical theory. In the interest of time, the discussion will be centred primarily on 2 books: Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody, by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, and the slightly more snappily titled and possibly better known, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race and Identity, by Douglas Murray. I'm delighted to say that with me to talk a little about these books and how they can help us understand critical theory is the Institute's social policy analyst and author of books including How Christianity Transformed the World and The Lies We Are Told, The Truth We Must Hold, Worldviews and Their Consequences, Dr. Sharon James. Sharon, welcome. And with her 2 other members of the CI team, researcher Daniel Friery and Public Affairs Assistant Joanna Cook. Welcome to both of you too. Okay, let's kick things off. Sharon, I gave a very short synopsis about critical theory there, but without repeating all the previous episodes of the podcast, could you just start by giving us a basic definition of critical theory? What are we talking about here?
You mentioned the Frankfurt School. Well, the conviction of the first director was that you can divide all of reality into traditional theories, and that's the kind of traditional disciplines that you might study at uni: history, philosophy, science. Traditional theories about understanding the world and studying it and passing knowledge on. But distinct to that, you have critical theory, which is not so much about understanding the world, it's about changing the world, it's about action. It's about getting the world to where it should be, which is a place where there are exactly equal outcomes. Now, as you look out at the world, you will see that there are not exactly equal outcomes. Sadly, there is oppression, injustice, which we know is caused by sin, but there are also disparities. Well, this way of thinking said all of those disparities in society are caused by structural, endemic oppression, whereby some groups hold on to privilege and keep their privilege at all costs at the price paid by all the other oppressed groups. So essentially it's dividing society into groups, hence identity politics, which is the modern iteration of that original critical theory.
Oh, thanks, Sharon. Well, let's get into the books then, and I want to start with Murray's book, The Madness of Crowds. The Times called it a call for free speech and nuance in what has become an age of hysteria, and possibly proving the point, The Guardian called it a right-wing diatribe and the bizarre fantasies of a right-wing provocateur. So different opinions there. Now, Murray's premise, as I see it, seems to be that religion and political ideology are in retreat. That makes it harder for people to identify a grand narrative, if you like, that gives their lives meaning. And that creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum has stepped postmodernism and a jumble of incoherent ideas connected loosely or directly to Marxism, things that used to be on the fringes of academia. So things that you've talked about in previous episodes, Sharon: social justice, identity politics, you've just mentioned, intersectionality, and having come from the fringes of academia, they're now mainstream and have sort of become the shibboleths, if you like, of the modern day. If just one quote from it. Most effectively, you can try to make people doubt absolutely everything. Make them doubt whether the society they live in is good at all. Make them doubt that people are really treated fairly. Make them doubt whether there are any such groupings as men and women. Make them doubt almost everything. And then present yourself as having the answers, the grand, overarching, interlocking set of answers that will bring everyone to some perfect place, the details of which will follow in the post. Now, if that is a summary of critical theory, has he got it right? Joanna, why don't you start us off?
Where Murray is really helpful is he recognises that identity politics, intersectionality, it just kind of exacerbates these divisions in our society. And in fact, it actually creates new ones. So rather than the message being, how can we get along better? The lessons of recent decades appears to be just exacerbating this sense that we're really not very good at living with each other. And intersectionality in particular, it just atomizes society into different interest groups, race, or based on race, sex, sexual orientation. And it presumes that such characteristics are the main or only relevant attributes of their holders. So we hear so often statements in our society speaking as a ... This notion that there's kind of a heightened moral knowledge that comes from being female or black or gay and so on. And what Murray says is just basically that we could spend the rest of our lives trying to identify each and every identity and vulnerability claim in ourselves and in others, and then trying to order along whichever system of power emerges from this perpetually moving hierarchy. And I think he's really helpful in identifying this because that is our experience. We're seeing an increasing number of divisions in our society, and rather than offering any sort of healing, it really just seems to be stoking divisions.
Well, we're going to come on to the healing aspect a little bit later on, because let's remind ourselves, Murray's not writing anything from a Christian perspective. But one of the interesting things I found about Murray was, and he doesn't talk about Orwell directly, I don't think. But if you've read 1984, you'll recall the famous scene in the middle of it where I forget which way around it is, but they're fighting East Asia, and then suddenly partway through the Great Hate Week celebration, word gets around that they're not really fighting East Asia, they're fighting Eurasia, and it's all a plot, and everything is torn down, and there's a very rapid switch in people's collective psyche, and I guess the Madness of Crowds title sort of reflects that. But I just wonder if you sort of carry that analogy through, it does seem that a lot of the things that we're talking about and will be talking about have happened very rapidly. If you take same-sex marriage for instance, very, very quickly, almost overnight, things switched around from being something that largely everybody supported, everybody had a clear idea that marriage was between a man and a woman, to something that couldn't even be disagreed upon, through to being the surefire mark of a fascist to uphold biblical marriage. Can you say something about that, how he addresses that sort of short-term memory or collective change in thinking?
He talks about what was barely disputed until yesterday has become basically cause to destroy someone's life today. And I think that's helpful because I think this is our experience. And he gives the example of how the claim that there live among us a considerable number of individuals who are trapped in the wrong body. And as a consequence, what kind of remaining certainties there are in our society need to be utterly reframed. So, for example, parents who voice the belief that a girl cannot become a boy or a boy cannot become a girl, now to just voice that truth, their fitness as parents are kind of questioned. And I think where Murray sees one of the key players in this kind of, as you talk about, this kind of rapid change that we're witnessing is academia. That there has been this real drive in academia to just kind of assail and undermine everything that had previously been fixed certainties. And that includes biological certainties. So if we look at the issue of sex, then the recognition that there are only two sexes became the suggestion that there are two genders, and eventually that moved on to the notion that there's no such thing as gender, that gender is just merely a social construct, it doesn't exist. And I think there's been a number of contributing factors, and I think social media is also one of them. You know, phrases like triggered or feeling unsafe, or claims that words that don't fit this new religion of identity politics has only spiked in usage since 2013. That's an area that Murray discusses. And I think it's had a real part in just embedding these ideas at such rapid pace because of the technological world in which we live.
Sharon, in previous episodes, you talked about one of the nature points, if you like, of critical theory being the push for change. So we're not interested in understanding the world as it is, we're interested in changing the world. So given what we've just heard from Joanna, should we really be surprised that there's about the rapidity of change? And let me ask you this, if the purpose is change, can there ever be an end to it?
Well, as far as the social justice, capital S, capital J, no, there will never be an end, because I'll tell you what the end point is. Go and read a book called Killing Fields, Living Fields by Don Cormack about what happened in Cambodia, where the end point was equality and they abolished the currency, and the only end point is complete equality, but that has to be amid the ruins, because you have to more or less destroy everything to get there. There is endlessly creating more division and distrust. So when you get DIE officers in any organisation, to keep themselves in a job, they more or less have to find more and more and more, unhappiness and discontent and injustice as they see it, to justify their jobs. No, it's a bottomless pit as far as this movement is concerned, and it doesn't get to the utopia. It ends up in a dystopia.
He's very good at exposing some of the contradictions within intersectionality in particular. So I wonder if we could talk just a little bit about that. So there's these hierarchies of oppression, and everybody needs to be put or seeks to be put into some one or more victim categories. Can we talk about that, this hierarchy of oppression, and what Murray has to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem to reflect the value that we should place on each person as an individual. Yeah. That's the fundamental difference between the Christian worldview and the critical theory worldview, is the Christian worldview teaches that every individual is valued as an individual, not just as part of their association with a group. So regardless of how the sort of various hierarchies of these rankings go, it's the individuality that's lost in the midst of this. And I know some people critiquing critical theory might look at intersectionality and say, does that not sort of reduce, if you put enough intersections together, eventually you get to individuality? And I think it's a problematic understanding, because it only, critical theory only ever understands things in terms of groups. Each of those groups that they're part of is how it's viewed.
Okay, so what answers does Murray offer, if any? So what should we take on board when we read this book, and where does he fall short?
Murray is helpful in that he really is an agent of common grace. He's able to see the contradictions that are around us. He really shines a torch on how identity politics has just become this new religion. And he's very accessible in terms of his writing style. He provides so many helpful examples, just ordinary everyday examples, to just demonstrate how pervasive these ideas are. But while he offers quite a comprehensive diagnosis, his kind of solutions are limited. And what he kind of fails to do is offer an alternative. So he finishes his book by just saying, one of the ways to distance ourselves from the madness of our times is to retain an interest in politics, but not to rely on it as a source of meaning. But then he doesn't offer an alternative. He says, find meaning elsewhere, but we're kind of just left there. And what he fails to say is that meaning and our purpose is found in God. And apart from that, we'll always be searching. And so I think while his diagnosis is just and is easy to follow, as a reader, you get to the end of the book and you say, well, there's still these divisions in our society. And there's still the strife and the tension, all these things, but what's the solution to that? And as Christians, we obviously know that there's no division. In Christ, we are one in Christ, that we have unity and we have an identity in him, and that our most important characteristics are not that we're female or male or any other. And I think that that's where kind of Murray falls short. He's unable to offer a comprehensive answer to that.
Great. Okay. Well, let's move on, because I did say that there was another book, and that is the Pluckrose and Lindsay book. It's not a prime academic tome in and of itself. There's also a what I'm calling the remixed version, which is basically the same stuff, but perhaps a little bit more accessible to the regular reader. If you haven't heard of Pluckrose and Lindsay, these are scholars who set out to expose the hold that critical theory has on academia. And they did that by infamously producing a bunch of fake academic papers to answer questions such as, do dogs suffer oppression based upon perceived gender? And got most of those papers published. Now, the approach that they take is to look at what we might call a series of small c, small t, I think, critical theories like queer theory, critical social justice, as manifestations of the big C, critical big T theory. So, Daniel, tell us, what do they set out as to be the primary issues as they see it with critical theory?
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary issues as they see it is the devoiding of reality. It's a separation of language and discourse around ideas from the realities themselves. And I think this is where they see the overreach in terms of critical theory compared to some of the other ideas, which, to be honest, they're quite happy to a certain degree to go along with. You know, they weren't waving their hands in the air when it came to Marxism or radical gender theory. It's when it's got to this stage and reality is undermined that they've really got interested in the issue. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that it loses all utility. It loses all its whole purpose. So if you think of even radical feminism, for example, you have still a reality of male and female from which those things are applied. So it still might be that they're saying, well, there's this sort of maleness that's oppressing my femaleness, and there's certain expectations that society has constructed around this, but it's still fundamentally linked to man and to woman as biological beings. But the step that critical theory has taken, the anathema for them, if you like, is that, well, what is maleness? What is femaleness? And suddenly you could construe maleness in a way that applies perfectly well to a female body. And that creates all sorts of problems as to its utility, its usefulness. Every chapter in this book, really, as he's looking at each of the theories, thinks, well, how will this help us as we engage in society? And you begin to see, you know, when you push this theory, pregnant men, questioning them, is that going to have any utility and purpose? You need reality in order to have meaning in society.
Now, in contrast perhaps to Murray, they do seem to go a little bit further in providing a solution. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Their solution, it seems to me, in a nutshell, is liberalism and perhaps more specifically secularism. Although I think I would, and perhaps others here, might take issue with their definition of secularism and whether that actually tallies with how secular humanists would espouse secularism. But I would take issue with the idea that rational thought, scientific method, the idea of human rights, these only began with the Enlightenment. They only resulted from the Enlightenment. And I think those of us with a biblical worldview, I'm not going to speak for you, but I suspect you would see it rather differently.
Yeah, the point that I think I would make is that it comes back again to this sense of reality. Liberalism is as they articulate, one aspect of it is the ability to know the world, that there are real things in the world. There is such a thing as a dog and a cat and a tree. And secondly, that we can know these things, that we're able to, in some sense, maybe not know everything about them, but comprehend them as distinct things. And that fits and tallies perfectly well with our biblical worldview. God made everything according to its kind. There's distinction. Critical theory seeks to blur the boundaries by using language and saying, can you really understand this as an individual item in the universe that God has created? And then secondly, as God made us to know things, we can know the world around us. Natural theology, we can look at the sun, and we're intended, as the way God has made us, to see from that, see the reality, and then praise God. So we have access to truth. And insofar as that's the definition of liberalism, those things are true and have that deeper rooted meaning. In fact, when you go the other way, they challenge epistemology based on how people know things in relative to culture. It really doesn't help anybody. There's a scholar that they quote, Amira Nanda, who's an Indian scholar, and she's thinking about her culture in India, and obviously all the social, political, economic problems in India. How do you fix them? Well, is it helpful if you begin to say, well, Indians don't really recognize science and don't really recognize access to knowledge because that's just a Western idea, and that in Indian culture we recognize knowledge is based on superstition and myth, and so we need to emphasize that and diminish the other. How does that help in social problems? But going on to where I think they fall short in their understanding of liberalism, this idea of universal human rights that you reference, Kieran, without God, these things are based on a inherently unstable foundation. I remember watching Jonathan Sumption, who was he was a High Court Justice, Supreme Court member and retired now. And he gave the Reef Lectures a few years ago, and he was thinking about human rights and what grounds do we have for human rights. And he said that basically you only boils down to having two human rights that are actually established, the right to life and the right to freedom of speech, because those things enable all the other things. But the rest of them are just sort of democratic ideas that we've come up with because society has come together under those necessary conditions of free to speak and free to live and decided them. Well, what grounding do those rights now have? Is it any surprise that discourse has become the dominant thing, that you can form rights based on language and ideas? Really, if you don't have God, liberalism's natural end is towards critical theory, I think I would argue.
So let me ask that broad question that I asked about Murray. What can we beneficially take away? How does this help us understand? How does this help those watching and listening understand the nature of and the dangers of and how to address critical theory?
I think you should read the book just to see where society is at right now. It's a brilliant description. It's a very well written description. Lots of examples. It's a powerful critique. So I recommend it. And you can also listen to them. There's plenty online that you can listen to. Helen Pluckrose is a great speaker to listen to, very appealing. James Lindsay, an amazing amount of resources online. So yeah, listen to them. But ultimately, they don't have the ultimate answer, but we can learn from them as to the problem. In the same way as Douglas Murray, please read that book by Douglas Murray. It's a great book, describes the problem very, very well, but thank the Lord we have a clearer solution at the end of it.
Okay, well, obviously we don't have the time to cover every book in this area. We only have the time to talk about these two. Plenty of other titles out there. Sharon, can I ask you, if you were to recommend one other book that isn't one of these two, that's written from a non-Christian perspective, that helps us in this area, what would that recommendation be? Well,
I just recently read a fairly new book by the journalist and author Andrew Doyle called The New Puritans. And I think that what he does in that book is he very pithily and nicely explains the way that identity is rushed into the void caused by the decline of Christianity in the West, and it's become a new religion, a new cult. And he describes the cult-like features that make it powerful and mesmerising and convincing to some, but also he's not a Christian. He regards religion as dangerous, and he regards this new religion as dangerous as well. So again, absolutely, I don't agree with everything he says in the book, but it's a powerful expose of some of the problems that are going on. And I think that he's right to see identity politics as very much an alternative, heretical religion.
Well, thank you to all of you. Next time we are going to be looking at some Christian writers, including Christopher Watkins' book, Biblical Critical Theory, That Hideous Strength by the late Melvin Tinker, and a brand new publication from our own Sharon James. Until then, goodbye.
For more great content, like, subscribe and hit the notification bell.